Beautiful. I know you're all tired, you had a long week, so we'll try and get through this PowerPoint quickly, painlessly, and maybe we'll even get out of here a little bit early so you guys can go and enjoy your weekend or whatever you're doing. No? You have a meeting? For real? Oh my God. A meeting about what? With those guys? Yeah! Well, you're very enthusiastic. Yeah! We got a meeting, all right. What time is the meeting?
After this time.
3 o'clock, right?
Yes.
Oh my God. Well, sorry. I'm doing I thought, you know, I'd get through this PowerPoint, get you out of here a little bit early, you can go do whatever you want to do. And then apparently, no. Cannot. Well, I apologize, but I'm still going to try and get you out of here, get this over with painlessly so that you can just vegetate for 20 minutes in like some comatose state, like in a cocoon or something, and then you'll be fine. All right, so we're going through HACCP again. Have you all taken some time to read through the final project? Yeah? Yeah, I hope so. And I don't recall. Was it presentations? Yeah, right? Food safety plan presentation, right? And was it in groups of 3 or 4? I can't remember.
3.
Threes, okay. Don't forget, soon I need your list. Okay, your who's with who. Who's with who. All right, so, but again, there's no urgent rush for that because I don't really need that list until you actually do your presentations, but I'd like it sooner so I can prepare your grading rubric for you. Okay, so this is going to give you a better idea of how to go about doing your final project, okay, in order to sort of identify, you're all very close to it. I don't think I've ever had a group of students stand this close to you before. Usually they're as far in the back of the room as they can get away from you, you know? So it's a little odd for me. Anyway, so we're going to go through a more in-depth. We looked at HACCP, we looked at the 7 steps of HACCP, right? We all remember what the 7 steps are, right? Analyze, CCPs, critical limits, monitoring, corrective action, validation, and record keeping, right? So now we're going to look. The record keeping is self-explanatory, right? Keep records, okay? And we'll look at some samples today of different types of records. And these are samples from different companies. Obviously, you can't use them for your project because they're from another company. But they'll give you an idea of how to set up your own template. You know what I mean by template, right? Like a form, right? So again, you can be creative with your project, name it, you know, give your restaurant a name, you know, make your menu, pick your menu item, you know, and go from there, right? But anyways, we'll go through the sheets and I'll explain to you a little bit how they're filled out, why they're filled out. But again, that's all fairly self-explanatory. The validation step, again, that's fairly self-explanatory, right? That's just going through, making sure that everything works properly, right? So what we're going to cover today, a little bit more in depth, is the analysis part, the CCP part, the corrective action part, and the critical limit part. Okay, and we'll go through that in a little bit more detail so that you can understand how to really do it properly. Okay, and again, it's a complex process, right? So you're obviously not going to be able to do it. You know, so it's going to take years and years and years to really understand this process and the HACCP process. But we'll go through it a little bit more today, and then you'll have a better idea. Oh, I hope you have a better idea. So accomplishing each step in HACCP or in your HACCP plan is very, very detail oriented. Okay, you have to be very thorough, right? One missed step, one missed protocol when you're doing your HACCP plan could lead to a serious problem down the road, right? If you miss a stage, miss a critical control point, miss a critical limit, miss a corrective action, that could then lead to a serious foodborne illness, right? And that could lead to illness, death, jail, whatever. You're out of business, okay? It's time consuming, okay, but it is of the utmost importance. It's paramount for food safety. Okay? Implementing a HACCP plan is done after some prerequisite programs and policies have been put in place and in practice in the operation. So, as I mentioned before, HACCP isn't some sort of magical thing that you just whoop, and it solves all your problems. Okay? Before you do a HACCP plan, you have to have prerequisite programs. You understand what a prerequisite is? Does everyone understand that term? You don't know what a prerequisite is?
I think what a prerequisite is, based on definition of pre and requisite.
So what is a prerequisite then?
Something that you need to do something.
Something you need before you can start the next thing, right?
Yeah.
So a prerequisite is something you need in order to start the next phase, right? So for example, in high school, when you take math in grade 10, before you can take math in grade 11, you need to finish and pass math in grade 10, right? Before you can take math 11, so that is a prerequisite, okay? So in terms of food safety and HACCP, prerequisite programs exist to give us the fundamental knowledge and the fundamental skills in order to practice proper food safety and proper food safety hygiene and knowledge, okay? Once we have those prerequisite programs, then we can move on to a proper hazard analysis and critical control point plan, okay? But without these prerequisites, I'm sorry, I thought I already moved to the next slide. Without these, yeah, it takes a bit of time, you know? I don't know. I was pointing at the screen like, change, but really it's down there. Without these prerequisite programs, this isn't an exhaustive list. There could be more, okay? But these are the sort of the main prerequisite programs that you would have. And this isn't in your book, so don't worry about it, okay? This PowerPoint will be on your e-learning. The material itself is not in your book. Most of it's just going to be talking and on the whiteboard, like going through some examples of things. So I can't put it all in your book, because your book would literally be, you'd have to hire like a Himalayan Sherpa to carry your books around the book. Okay? It'd be too much information. So I try to streamline it into your books. At any rate, I've always told the school we should just have electronic books, and it doesn't matter. Yes?
I agree with you, but I don't know.
Talking about Sherpas?
Huh?
About the Sherpas?
No, about the
electronic books.
Yeah.
Yeah, I told the school, like, just get away with this paper book. Like, hello, it's 2021. And guess what? Taiwan doesn't grow paper trees. They import all the paper. So like, there's no pulp industry in Taiwan. None of this paper is made. It has to be imported, right? So just get rid of it. At any rate, I've told them many times we should just do an electronic book. But they're like, no, students need a book. At any rate, so these prerequisite programs, such as distributor certification, so as I mentioned before, working with a food supplier that has a HACCP plan that's been food safety certified by the government, right? This is a prerequisite program, okay? This is not something that would be involved in your HACCP plan. It's something you make sure that you have done before your HACCP plan. Because if the food's contaminated when you get it, it doesn't matter if you have a HACCP plan, right? It's already contaminated. Training programs. Training programs related to food hygiene, food safety, food science, things like that. Allergen management. So again, this would be something related to the management of allergies within your business. So if you're producing food, for example, you make peanut butter and you make other products, then you have to make sure that your management of allergens, keeping those things separate, are important. For example, when you look on certain products, you might see on the back it says, produced in a facility that may produce peanuts. Okay? You've probably seen that. It's a very, very common thing to see on the back of a food product. So that would be allergen management. Because it's very, very difficult to 100% guarantee that a small sliver of peanut doesn't get from A to B into the wrong product, right? And some people have very, very severe allergies to peanuts, okay? For example, just an example. So allergen management, making sure that your building is separated in a certain way to manage processing, but also that you've labeled your products to make customers aware that there may be traces of peanut or soybeans or something like that in this product. Okay? Buying specs or buying specifications. Again, this is kind of relative to distributor certification in that you make sure that you set up a very codified or specific standards for how you buy products, in what form, what format, what packaging, what size. Okay, so when you buy chicken breast, we only buy frozen chicken breast. They're individually wrapped, things like that. Okay, so all the things you buy in your restaurant or in your hotel, you have a defined list, defined specifications of who we get it from, how it must be packaged. Okay, and there's no deviation. When there's a deviation from that buying specification, the product is returned immediately. There's no, I don't know, maybe let me ask my boss. It's immediately, sorry, this we don't accept. You take it back and bring us tomorrow or today the specific one we have an agreement for. Okay? Recipe and process instructions. Again, this is making sure that your recipes are very, very detailed. So in terms of measurements, right? My recipes are always either in grams, kilograms, liters, milliliters, or by the piece. For example, eggs. I might do some recipes in grams, I might do some by the piece, but I never use things like cups, tablespoons, teaspoons, pinches, dashes, any of that stuff, because it's inaccurate. But the process also, a very detailed list of step by step by step by step, exactly how you make this product, and exactly how you process the product once it's cooked. So once it's cooked, then what do we do with it? Do we cool it? If we cool it, do we do the 1 stage or the 2 stage? Once it's cooled, how do we package it? Do we vacuum pack it in 1 liter bags and freeze it? Do we vacuum pack it in 5 liter bags and freeze it? Do we vacuum pack it, pasteurize it, put it in the fridge? Okay? So the recipe and the process is incredibly detailed. Not just, cook your meat, and then add your tomatoes, put some salt in, cook it for a bit, simmer for 10 minutes, and then put it in the fridge. Or cool, it's good, right? That's not a recipe, okay? That's me telling my buddy, last night when I got home from the bar, I went to my fridge and I made myself some spaghetti bolognese. That's me telling him, right? A recipe is in a very detailed, exact procedure, okay? If you went to the doctor and you were like, so what exactly are you gonna do? He's like, well, we're just gonna cut you open a bit here. I'm gonna go through and just move some stuff around, and I'm looking for this thing, and if I see it, I'm just gonna take it out. If I don't see it, I'll probably just sew you back up and whatnot. You think it'd be cool in 10 days or something. I don't know. You'd be like, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to a real doctor who knows what they're talking about, right? So there's no difference, right? Obviously one is a little more life-threatening, the other one's not. FIFO, which you all know already, right? FIFO, first in, first out. That's another prerequisite program. And then other SOPs depending on the type of operation you have. Remember that one HACCP plan is not suitable for all businesses, right? HACCP plans are defined by the products and processes and ingredients they use, right? The ingredients, all ingredients require different attention in terms of hazard management or CCP management, right? Not all ingredients are the same. Not all processes are the same. Not all final products are the same, okay? So a HACCP plan is very specific to the type of operation and the ingredients, processes, and products they're making, okay? Which is why there is not one HACCP plan for, it's not the Lord of the Rings, okay? It's not one HACCP plan to rule them all. There's one for each operation. Even two businesses that make the same final product could have very different HACCP plans, right? They might make identical final products, right? But that doesn't mean they start or cook or finish in the same way, right? So it's very, very detail-oriented, all right? First and foremost, it is important to get your hazard analysis done. So one of the prerequisite programs in a HACCP operation would be your receiving department, right? They would have specific receiving requirements. But for us, for our learning purposes now, today especially, we're not going to include receiving in our prerequisite program. We're going to add that into our HACCP plan, okay? Just to make it a little more thorough, so that you can think a little bit about what's exactly going on. From there, we can start to identify our CCPs. So for these examples, for what we're going to do today, I just printed out a simple recipe. You can have one. Just share that with your group. I'm not going to give you each a recipe. You guys need to look over this. this. Okay, share it amongst your group. Take a few minutes, read through the ingredients. Okay, if you don't understand what an ingredient is, then ask. I can't reach. I'm trapped. There's a barrier. Hey, don't forget when I'm moving here. Yeah. I just went over there. I didn't see the camera. Yeah? You have to remember it. There you go. So every table's got one, right? Yes? Every table has an example? All right. Read through. And then I'm just going to go to the whiteboard here. And we'll just start. There's only a few processes really involved in this recipe, but we're going to go through it in a bit more detail. All right, so wake up, please. Everybody understands the ingredients in there? It's all, oh, there you go, look at that. They're all fairly straightforward ingredients, right? Ground beef, ground pork. Pancetta is basically pork belly, Italian pork belly, okay? I think, what else is in your recipe? Canned tomatoes, right? Onions, garlic, tomatoes, tomato paste, red wine, chicken stock, butter, flour, basil, oregano, basil, Parmesan cheese, salt, pepper. Okay? Don't worry about so much the fine print or the details in the recipe, but look at the ingredients, the main ingredients themselves, right? So the first thing we need to do is look at this recipe, and in our stages here, okay? So when we talk about receiving, we're just going to break this down to 4 basic steps, okay? Yeah, 4 basic steps. So we have receiving, storage, cooking, processing, and then service. Okay, and service is really quite simple. It's not even really a factor in passive language, so I wasn't kind of into this. So now let's assume for this particular recipe, okay, in a restaurant you would never make 1 portion of pasta sauce, right? It would be inefficient. This recipe is what we use in school. So obviously in school we're not going to make 10 liters of pasta sauce for 1 group, because that would be way too much. You guys would be taking home gigantic bags of pasta sauce, okay? And that's also not efficient. So let's assume for this particular recipe that we purchase things in bulk and we cook in bulk, okay, meaning volume. Okay? Instead of 1, we make enough pasta sauce for 100, okay? So looking at your listed ingredients, the first thing we need to do is assess hazards. Hazards, and we're going to go into hazards next week and the week after. And hazards come in 4 varieties, okay? Basically they come in physical, chemical, allergen, and biological. That's in the book. It's right on that page. Oh, yeah, I can overview. Okay, so these are our 4 basic food habits. We're going to get into this. We're going to get into this more depth next week. Okay. So when we're receiving products from that recipe, you're going to be able to receive things in different groups. Okay. So how would you group those things together? Looking at the list, what items on there would you group together? Yeah. So our ground meats, right? So when we receive our products, we have our ground meat, well, that all goes together, and our pancetta, yeah? So these are the only meat products in that recipe, right? Ground beef, ground pork, and pancetta, yeah? The 3 items, yeah? So that would be 1 grouping for receiving. We have onions and garlic, correct? Yes. Those would be the only fresh, and shiitake mushrooms, right? Those are the only fresh vegetables in there, correct?
Good base vegetables.
Yes, yeah, fresh basil. So we got onion, we got garlic.
Or it's
Dry, that's right. Onion, garlic, mushroom, and basil, fresh. Okay? So that's another group. What else do we have in there? We'd have dry goods, yeah?
Yeah.
So we'd have canned tomatoes, right? Yeah, tomato paste. Hold on a sec. I can't write that fast. Tomato paste, oregano, basil. Okay, please, don't yell 50 things at once. What else? Flour. Yeah. Salt. Pepper. Butter would not be a dry ingredient. That would be a dairy ingredient. Right, so that's another one altogether. What other dry ingredients do we have there? What do we use to make? Thank you very much. Kind of the main part, right? You can't really make pasta without the pasta. Is that everything? No? Well, that's dairy, but good. Yes, red wine. Anything else?
Chicken stock.
Chicken stock we would make ourselves.
Okay.
I never buy chicken stock, ever. So that wouldn't be in the receiving part. However, that would be maybe, okay, let's go there.
So like those kind of like pantry items, or like how just make them?
Dry storage.
Okay.
So let's just say we order chicken bones, we also order carrot and celery to make our chicken stock, okay? Basic chicken stock, chicken bones, carrot, celery, onion, or mirepoix, right? Boom, chicken stock down. Okay, so we have chicken bones on the list, onions, carrot, and celery. Is that everything? I believe so, yeah. Yeah? So we've got our different categories here. We've got our meats, we've got our vegetables, we've got dairy, and we've got dry storage. Okay? So now, in our receiving HACCP, when we start to like look into the HACCP part, what would be the most potentially hazardous things to receive here? This one, right? So as we look, whiteboard eraser over there? There's one over there. We have a room with whiteboard erasers. Every time I come here, they're always gone. It's like somebody comes in at night and steals them. Oh no, they're hiding. They're there. All right, I'm just gonna wipe off this board here. Okay. So we have our ground meats, right? So now when we look at this, we have to determine what could be some potential hazards that could come of this. Can anybody think of some? What would be the most obvious one? E. coli. Well, E. coli is one. I'm not talking specific, I don't mean like, that's good, but I don't mean specifically like E. coli or staphylococcus, but think bigger. Biological hazard, right? Yeah, so biological parasitic, so biological food hazard, right? So then we start to look at, okay, what are the hazards, okay? So for sure from this, we have biological, right? I.e. E. coli, very quick to it. What would be a hazard? E. coli! It's like you just waited for that. I had it right here. E. coli. I'm going to try this one. I'm going to try the left one. That's salmonella over there. That was coli. Food poisoning. All right. So biological. Okay. So that would be, yeah, E. coli, staph, etc., etc. Okay. So we would look at the different types of bacterial infections that are associated with these. Okay. So these would then go into our hazard analysis. This is a hazard that we have at this step. Okay. What other hazards might be related to that? Physical, yeah? Yeah, who said that? Okay, sorry, whenever I was in math on, it's like, I don't know who said something, it's just like, yes, physical is a possibility because during the receiving stage, things are being moved in and out of boxes, they're going from a truck to a kitchen area, right? So there's definitely some physical, there's definitely a possibility of some physical contamination. What else? Allergen? I mean, maybe, sure, but the chances are very, very, very low that an allergen could make it into that. Okay, so we probably wouldn't consider that in our hazard plan. And then chemical, again, not really. So we look basically at physical, which could include things like metal, plastic, right? Because usually glass. Who said that? I can't still see your mouth. Oh, sorry, I thought it was you. You throw your voice really well, like a ventriloquist. Glass?
Glass.
I mean, not really. I can't where okay. Where would glass come into it? Like how? From like the sky? Like where? No, because this is refrigerated, this is dry storage.
Oh, yeah.
And most red wine in retail or in kitchen comes in Tetra Paks or boxes, right?
Chef, what would be an example of chemical hazard?
A chemical hazard would be something like gasoline, bleach, oven cleaner, hydrogen peroxide. Think chemicals we use in kitchens to clean things. Okay, deep frying cleaner. There's some pretty intense cleaners in kitchens that you obviously don't want to do at food. So, but we'll get into chemicals later in the course when we talk about workplace hazardous material identification system. But good question. Because there are a lot of chemicals used in kitchens, right? If you look in the kitchens now, right, you always see different bottles of chemicals lying around, right? And some kitchens, they leave them lying around a bit too much. Anyways, glass. So, not from the bottles, because those come in Tetra Paks, because we use our buying specification. Our buying specification is that all wine comes to the kitchen in cardboard boxes and in plastic Tetra Paks. So what would be another hazard? Wood.
From crates.
Sorry?
From the crates.
Food doesn't really get delivered in crates anymore. That's like the 1800s. But in 2020, it comes in plastic bins. So let's stick with, we got metal, we got plastic. Metal could come from the car, could come from the door of the truck, could come from the forklift lifting the food up, right? Glass, I mean, unless the guys wear like glasses, they shatter. I just don't see glass being a major hazard. Not enough to make it a hazard, okay? But good thoughts. So now, okay, what about hazards for our dry goods? Hazards for our dry goods. How do we get canned tomatoes? They come in a can. So possible hazard would be biological, right? If a can is dented, canned food only lasts long because it's a sealed environment, right? As soon as a can is rusted or dented, it may not look like the can is broken or there's a hole, but there very likely is a hole. And that can lead to a very deadly bacterial infection. So again, we'll put biological up there. Physical, not so much, because it's a canned good, right? Allergen, not so much, because it's a canned good. It's a sealed environment. We know exactly what's in there already. And chemical, again, not so much. So from our dry goods, really only the canned items would pose a potential hazard, okay? Our dairy, again, would be under biological, okay? There's, again, a possibility of maybe some physical, but really, these things are all sealed package containers, or sealed packaging, so they really wouldn't have any kind of physical contaminant in there, all right? Most likely not, anyways. So this is sort of how you go about developing a hazard analysis, right? Going through each particular part of the operation and figuring out what is going to be a hazard. Now, we then have to look at it in terms of the likelihood of it happening, okay? How likely is it that a piece of metal is going to be inside of our ground meat? Probably very low, because we have distributor certification. We buy our ground meat from another company. That company, when they grind their meat, run it through a metal detector, right? So they can tell if there's metal inside already or not, right? So that prerequisite program then mitigates that. We don't have to worry about that anymore, okay? Plastic, how likely is plastic? Actually, it's quite likely. Because I've had plastic in my food before. I've gone to a restaurant, eaten something, and there's plastic. So it's quite likely, right? So we would leave that on me, okay? In terms of the biological hazard, then we would have to look at how likely is that, right? Very, very likely, right? The chances of a biological contamination happening in here or here, and even to an extent in some of these, is very, very high, right? So now we've identified our hazards, at least the hazards that we deem to be the most important, right? Now we have to start to look at what processes we can do to actively or effectively control these hazards from happening, right? So the easiest one, the simplest one for this is temperature control, right? So we make sure that when food is received, we receive it at 4 degrees or below, right? We check the temperature. If it's above temperature, we reject the order. So we don't want it, take it back. Because we can't guarantee how long that's been out of temperature for, right? If we accept that product, we are then taking a very big risk, right? We can't say for sure how long it's been out of temperature for, so therefore we can't determine how long it's been contaminated for. So it's too great of a risk. We return the product we don't want, right? The same thing for canned tomatoes. Again, this would be part of sort of a prerequisite program, but we're going to include in our HACCP one just so you guys think about, really evaluating all the small details, right? If you see a dented or damaged or rusted can of tomatoes, what do you do with it? Return it, right? You don't accept the order, right? I mean, we don't return, we just don't accept it, right? So again, that would really be part of the prerequisite program, but we'll include it in this just so that you guys and girls can sort of think about really evaluating each step of the process, right? And how to properly kind of evaluate what is a hazard, what isn't a hazard, and how to define it, okay? So that's kind of how we do it for the receiving, okay? So now let's extrapolate this forward into our storage, okay? In terms of storage, what would be our protocol then, our prerequisite or our HACCP protocol for storing these goods? What about this?
Different level of refrigerant.
Exactly. So we put it into the fridge, okay? Or maybe we buy it frozen. Who knows, right? Depends again on your buying steps. If you buy it frozen, it goes directly to the freezer, and then you take it out as you need it, right? But for this, let's just say we buy it, we put it in the fridge, right? And yes, as Juan mentioned, we put it in the fridge following a specific order, right? Same with our dairy products, right? They go into the fridge, preferably into a separate area. If not, they can follow a specific order, right? Our dry goods, they go into the dry storeroom, right? And again, 15 cm off the ground, right? Not 15 m, okay? Not 15 km, 15 kilometers off the ground, right? So again, the storage would then be split up into these sort of categories here. And you can sort of split it up into quadrants, or depending on how many different sections you have from your receiving to your storage. For example, when you do your storage of your dry goods, a lot of things are shipped to us in boxes, right? We buy cases of canned tomatoes in boxes. So one of the protocols would be that when we receive canned tomatoes, and this is part of your other SOPs, right? So prerequisite program, your other SOPs dictate that when we receive cases of canned tomatoes or canned anything, that before they make it into the kitchen, they are removed from the boxes. The cans are inspected, right, for rusting or for denting. Also check the production and expiry date, because you never know, right? But that's a given. Good morning, sweetheart. Sound that, Becky? All right. Your dry goods receiving would also have a minor SOP or prerequisite program or details in order to effectively make sure that your receiving department is putting the things where they're supposed to go, right? Makes sense, right? Yes, of course it does. It's just a lot of... Right? Okay. So we're going to zip forward. Storage, we've done that. Again, storage, we do have hazards, right? The same hazards that would be present here would also be present here, right? So let's just move that forward. Now we've got our biological hazards in our storage. So when we receive products, we check the temperature, right? We make sure that it's cold. Now that we store things in the fridge, what is the other thing that we do to ensure that they stay cold?
Keep records in the
fridge.
Yes. We do daily, what were you going to say?
The fridge.
Sorry?
Nothing.
The fridge, what? Nothing. Keep talking, maybe. Yes, the fridge. So, as Juan mentioned, we check the fridge temperatures morning and night, right? And we make a record, right? You will come in the morning, you walk over to the fridge, you check the outside, write it down. Check the inside temperature, write it down, right? And then you initial it and write what time it is and the date, right? Then maybe you work in the nighttime, you come in, high five, see you later. You do the same thing. You check the inside, the outside, write it down, initial it, date, time, and then usually there's a remark comment box as well. If there's something wrong, you put the temperature off. We've already contacted the repairman to come and check it, okay? That's a whole other story. That's a huge pain in the ass when the fridge breaks. Ugh, what a nightmare. So, fast forward to our storage, we've got our dry storage stuff put away. It's in sealed containers to stay fresh, to make sure that there's no contamination going inside. We've got it 15 centimeters off the ground to prevent contamination from insects, right, or rodents. And we've got our fridge and freezer temperatures checked, and that's all good, okay? Right? Perfect. Fast forward to our cooking and processing, okay? So now, this is really the most critical area, right? These are fairly straightforward things, right? Most of this part here is prerequisite. We don't really have to worry about it too much, okay? Now we get into our cooking and our processing stages, right? Which would be the most critical, the most dangerous time for our food to be in. So as I mentioned before, we make our don't ever drop anything. We make our, especially a drink, we make our pasta sauce in volume, okay? So, let's just say that the recipe says you've got your ground beef, you've got your ground pork, your pancetta, you have to dice very small, your garlic you have to mince, your onions you have to dice, your mushrooms you have to slice, okay? So, what would be a possible hazard here for that process? Cross-contamination, right? Because we have processing of raw meats, cured meats, and vegetables, right? So part of our HACCP plan would be to identify, at this stage, there's a possibility of cross-contamination because of processing meats and processing vegetables, right? So that would be part of our color-coded cutting board system, right? Which is part of your HACCP plan. So you would define in your recipe, using a red cutting board, dice your shiitake mushrooms, right? Remove your red cutting board, clean it, sanitize it, put it away, or take it to a stewarding area to get washed if your operation is big enough to have a separate stewarding area, which is nice. Then get a green cutting board, cut your onions, cut your garlic, cut your mushrooms, remove your green cutting board, sanitize your workstation, sanitize your knife, right? All that stuff will be part of your HACCP plan, okay? Now it comes time to actually cooking your bolognese sauce, okay? So the first part of the cooking process would involve, let's say, browning off your ground meat, your ground pork, ground beef, getting some color on it, adding your pancetta, adding your vegetables, adding your flour, your butter, your wine, your canned tomatoes, da-da-da-da. Then you're going to cook it to a certain temperature, right? What would that temperature be? Which is same as chicken.
165.
165. Okay. 165. You say 56? Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. That's the time. That's the time. First, let's talk about temperature, okay? Don't go getting carried away. So again, this would be part of your HACCP plan, okay? That is a point, a critical control point, right? We've now identified, and I'm going to go through with you how to identify critical control points, okay? So we've now identified the stage here where we have to cook it to 165 degrees is a critical control point because cooking it to 165 degrees is a control method that we use to prevent bacteria from growing, right? Or killing any bacteria that's in there. So that is a control or a process that we do to stop any hazard or reduce the hazard from happening. So now we've identified this is a critical control point. Okay? Then we determine the critical limit, which is 15 seconds at 165. How much time? 15 seconds at 165 degrees. So our critical limit, our critical control point we've determined is the cooking process. Our critical limit is we have to cook it to 165 for 15 seconds to ensure that we have killed any possible E. coli. Yeah, there we go. There we go. 15 seconds, E. coli. I like it. Could be a movie here, maybe like 15 seconds to E. coli. So that's our critical control point. We've identified our critical limit, okay? And so that goes into our HACCP plan, okay? And that is a separate sheet unto itself in the process of making bolognese sauce, okay? So most of this stuff would then be relegated or moved to prerequisite, okay? And our first real official CCP document or CCP step in the bolognese process would be the cooking process, okay? Now, as I mentioned before, we make bolognese sauce in a large volume, right? But obviously when we make it, we're not going to serve 100 portions of bolognese at once, right? So once it's made, now what do we have to do? Think what we've talked about already. We've cooked something to 165 degrees for, what do you say? Yeah! We cool it down. But how do we do that?
One step.
No. Well, there's two different ways you can do it, right? So you can either use stage 1 cooling or stage 2 cooling, right? And why do we do that? Because if we don't cool it down properly, we could get. Yes. So now we've identified another hazard here, right? Biological. So we've cooked it. We've identified our CCP1, okay? CCP1 is our cooking process, okay? Now we have to cool it down, right? So we don't just put it on the counter, you know, go hang out with our friends, maybe shoot some hoops, come back in 6 hours, like, is it cold? I don't know, let me get those flies off. Yeah, it's kind of warm. Okay, just throw it in the fridge. We don't do that, right? Because that can grow bacteria, right? So, the cooling process is another control that we apply. Yes, I'm getting to CCP. But I'm trying to get you all to say things like control, because that's what it is. So, the cooling process is another control that we do to make sure that the hazard is effectively reduced or eliminated. All CCPs is a way to make sure we either reduce or eliminate a hazard, right? That's what a CCP is, okay? And the critical limit defines how we do that. So now we've identified our CCP2. CCP2. Okay, so CCP1, CCP2. Okay? So CCP2 would say something along the lines of, and again, you have to determine in your operation, are we going to use one-stage cooling or two-stage cooling? Okay? Different things can use different methods, right? Some things can use stage 1 because they're very easy to cool down. Some things can use stage 2 because they're a little more difficult to cool down. Okay? So let's say that we determine that for this, we're going to use two-stage cooling. Okay? Because we want to make sure that we have enough time to cool it down. It's very hot. You know, we cook it over 165 degrees for, you've got it, you want to eliminate. Bam! Love it. This is professional wrestling. I have my two tag team guys right here. This is the HACCP tag team of the WWE. So, our two-stage cooling process would then state what? That we have to cool it down from, yeah, to, in, no, more than 2 hours. Come on, 15 seconds. You're my time guy. Yeah, come on. Time guys. He's only good for 15 seconds. Anyways. So, 140 to 70 in 2 hours, and then 70 to below 41 in 4 hours, right? Maximum 6 hours. So that would be our CCP2. Our critical limit has been set at the 6 hours of cooling. Okay, that's our critical limit. Okay? Make sense? So we've kind of gone through and evaluated what process happens when. Okay? In terms of this stage, in terms of things like, you might also have something like a physical hazard. Okay? Most kitchens that you work in don't allow, most kitchens that I worked in, don't allow wood spoons and stuff, right? Because over time those wood spoons deteriorate, the wood comes off, right? So there is a possibility that a physical hazard could happen based on a piece of wood coming off. Who said wood before? Yeah, so now the wood comes into play. So not in the crates, but in the spoon. So your prerequisite program would be that we do not allow glasses in the kitchen. Who said glass before? 15 seconds. So we don't allow glasses in the kitchen. Our prerequisite program eliminates that hazard of glass getting in the food. We don't allow wooden cooking spoons into the kitchen because that eliminates the hazard of the physical hazard of wood going into the food. Okay? So you can determine a hazard and then say, wait a minute, I think our prerequisite already covers that, right? And then you can eliminate it from your hazard plan. Okay? You don't want to have too many hazards and things in your plan because then it becomes very, very complicated, very taxing on your HACCP system. So the more stuff you can eliminate with your prerequisites, the more smooth and streamlined your HACCP plan can be. Okay, so now our CCP2 is done. Okay, now we package our bolognese sauce. Some of it goes in the freezer because we want to store it for long use. Some of it is vacuum packed and kept in the fridge. Okay, now we're going to go to service. So for service, we start to cook our fettuccine. Not really any hazard there, right? No. But we need to reheat our bolognese sauce, right? So to what temperature do we have to reheat the bolognese sauce to? Or? Whoa, I think we got a new guy. We got a 15-second champ here. I don't know. We'll have to see. Another day we'll have like a 15-second off. See who really reigns supreme in the 15-second game. So our CCP3 has now been determined. Our CCP3. Now this is just for one product. This is just for the bolognese sauce, right? So you have to do this for every single product you make. Okay? So it's, like I said, it's a very lengthy process, right? But once you've got it going, you can essentially plug and play with different things. Because a lot of hazards are the same for different products, right? Or different recipes. So you can essentially use the same controls and stuff like that for other recipes, right? But it's a good idea in the beginning to look through it and really determine all the hazards, okay? Anyway, so our CCP3 has now been determined as reheating the bolognese sauce for 165 degrees for 15 seconds, adding your fettuccine, mixing, plating, garnishing, and out, okay? So now and this is a very basic HACCP design, right? But I want to show you a little bit more about like the way you have to think about, you know, each single step, each single process, okay? Now for each of these CCPs, you would have a production sheet, right? So this one would have a cooking sheet or a production sheet, and we'll get into this in a minute. This one would have our cooling sheet, get our cooling log. This would have our reheat log, okay? So all of these CCP steps, we have the production sheet, the cooling sheet, the reheating sheet. All of them would be filled out by the cooks, okay? So this is how you go about determining the hazards for each step, the CCPs for each step, the critical limits for each step. So for example, also, when we have our CCP2 here, cooling, right, at the end of the 6 hours, if we have not reached our below 41 degrees, what's our corrective action? 2.
Reheat.
Yeah, 2. Not 2 times reheat. 4. Yes. So, yes.
If we, let's say we get, instead of ground meats, we get a chunk of like pork or beef, and we grind it ourselves. So that's processing, right?
Yeah, that would be in here, yeah.
Is that another CCP or does that count as production?
Well, it would be the same
Yeah, it will be
chain of events.
Right, or will it be a different critical control point?
No, so it would probably be CCP1. So good question. So let's just say, as Juan brought up, let's say that we're really go-getters, you know, we like to grind our own meat, you know. Hey, maybe we raise our own cows, we kill it ourselves, right? We bring it into our kitchen, okay? Has anyone here ever killed a cow before? Me either. I don't want to. But I have reached my hand in the stomach of a cow, which was also very weird. It was like a scientific cow, not like a lab cow. He didn't wear a jacket. It was like a cow on a farm. Most farms, they have one cow, they have a cow that has like a glass thing on its stomach, and they can open it up and you can reach in and see what it's been eating and check its feed and stuff like that.
They put some vitamins inside.
Well, they don't put anything in it, they take stuff out. They're looking to make sure that, see what the cow's been eating, see what it's digesting, how it's digesting, things like that. So, let's just say that, yes, okay, so I'm just going to go 2 and 3, and then CCP1, we bring in our own meat. So CCP1 would then be that we take the meat and we grind it. Again, this would have 2 possible hazards. What would they be? Biological and physical, right? Grinding meat is you're using what material? Metal, right? And it's metal on metal, right? So there's lots of, not a high probability, but there is a chance that you could get metal inside your ground meat. Now, in most cases, in a small restaurant, their CCP1 would involve keeping the meat below 4 degrees, right, while you're processing it. So taking out just what you need to grind, grinding it, putting it in the fridge, taking out more, grinding it, you know, sort of like a cycle, right, so that it never gets above 4 degrees. The other part of that CCP would then include a visual inspection. Because it's not likely that you would send, in a small restaurant, you wouldn't send your meat through a metal detector, right? Or you get a metal detector, then you're off to the beach, like, I'm gonna go find some coins. So it's not really likely that you would implement a CCP more than visual inspection of the ground product, right? You would look physically at the ground product and see if there's any shiny bits of metal in there. But that's kind of what you would install in there. Some CCPs control that stage of it. So that would be then your CCP 1, 2, and 3, if you were bringing in meat yourself, okay? Which then, that would then make this CCP 4. So, this is a very simplified approach to doing asset planning, okay? But the methodology is the same, okay? Obviously, it would take a lot longer if we had a much more in-depth production scheme or production route. Again, also, I almost forgot, we made our own chicken stock, right? Right. So the chicken stock would follow almost an identical path. And so that's what I said when I said that not all HACCP plans are designed for each operation, okay? You can kind of plug and play with each different thing. So for the HACCP plan for the chicken stock, it would be essentially the identical thing because you're using almost identical PHMs, right? Chicken stock, you have to cook it to 165 degrees, which is no problem because chicken stock you can cook for 4 hours, so there's no 15 seconds, don't worry. But that would still be, you would still have a production log for it, saying that you reached 165 for 15 seconds, right? Even though you go well beyond that, still keep records, right? Because if the health department comes, they're going to say, all right, can you show us your records, right? And you show them records for everything you make, they're going to say, wow, these guys, they know what's going on, okay? Again, once you start to make the chicken stock, you would also strain it and then visually check for small bones because you don't want to be serving anybody a small bone in their food, right? So similar to this stage, when we grind our own meat, we do a visual inspection for metal, we can also do a visual inspection for bones in our chicken stock. The chicken stock would then follow the same cooling process, right? Cooling and processing, okay? And that would then go into our production of our bolognese sauce. However, the chicken stock would be a separate passive log, right? It's passive file, right? You know what I mean? It wouldn't be part of the same bolognese log. It would actually be over here, right? Because we make the chicken stock before we make the bolognese sauce, right? So that one would lead into this one, okay? Oh my God, so much talking, so much straining in the voice. Does that make sense? All right, let's take a 5-minute break. I really need to drink something because my throat is going to close up on me like the Yeti desert. Perfect. Regular Steven Spielberg. Okay. All right, let's carry on, please. I just had a funny, you're so close. Over here, I was just talking to our administrator, Elizabeth, and she said, oh, you have a package in the administration building. I said, package? Package of what? She said, I don't know. They don't know what it is. Then I thought to myself, what have I asked for recently? I often ask people to send me stuff. They do for some reason. I don't know why. So I remember asking a supplier to send me a bag of rice because we're making some rice on Monday in 2A class, 2A cooking class. But I don't need much. I told them, I said I just need a couple kilograms. Because we only have 8 groups in our cooking class and 3 or 4 students per group. So I need about a couple kilograms. Not much. So they just told me it's a 30-kilogram bag of rice. And so I just called the guy. I said, hey, and it's the wrong rice. I said, hey, did you send me a bag of rice? And they're like, well, yeah, we did. I said, but it's the wrong rice. They're like, yeah, we found out after we sent it that it's the wrong one. I said, well, what am I supposed to do with it? They're like, do whatever you want with it. I was like, it's 30 kilos of rice. Like, how much rice do you think I eat? Not much, by the way, let me tell you. But I don't know, now I have to go get it later. I'm like, what am I going to do with it? I can't even carry a bag of food. It's like carrying a dead body. What am I going to do with a 30-kilo bag of rice? It's like 64 pounds of rice. Uncooked. Once that's cooked, that's like almost 300 pounds. Anyways, so that process we just went through there is a very basic, simple, step-by-step process of how to sort of look at each step of your operation, determine what kind of hazards you have, right, in each process, then determine what your CCPs are, determine what your critical control limits are, what your critical limits are, sorry, not your critical control limits. So you identify your CCPs and you identify your critical controls, your limits, and then your corrective actions, right? And that's kind of how you have to go through making a hazard plan. Like I said, it's quite a process. It takes quite a bit of time to actually really go through it all, step by step by step by step. But that should give you all a better idea of how to go about doing your final project, right? Because that's essentially what your final project is, right? It's taking a menu item and then going through each step of the receiving to the storing, to the cooking, to the cooling, to the serving, and identifying what your hazards are, what your control points are, and what your limits are and what your corrective actions are, right? And then the other part of that is also defining how you want to record this information. Okay, we just did this already. We just looked at our CCPs. So when you're, when you're developing your CCP list, sometimes, quite often, it's very easy to do and very common to do using what's called a CCP decision tree. Now, this doesn't really look like a tree. It's just basically another flow diagram, but they call it a decision tree. When using a decision tree, you have to use common sense, okay? So when we did ours just now, we didn't use the decision tree. I just sort of did it with you verbally. But we determined that some hazards were eliminated in our prerequisite programs, right? So the same has to be done when you're using a decision tree. Okay? Because if you just use a decision tree and don't use common sense, then you're going to have hundreds of hazards, hundreds of control points, hundreds of pages of documents you have to fill out. It doesn't make sense. It becomes too difficult to control. Okay? So we'll look at an example of a decision tree. So basically, and unfortunately you can't read this so well because it's very, very small, but basically it says, do control preventative measures exist? So control preventative measures are like what we discussed about. We cook something to a certain temperature. We cool it to a certain temperature by a certain time. We store it at a certain temperature, okay? So these are control preventative measures. If a control preventative measure, i.e. cooking to 165, cooling to below 40, etc., if there's a preventative measure, if the answer is yes, then you go to the next step. If you answer no, is control at this stop necessary for safety? So if you've answered no, there's no preventative measure, then you go down to here, is it necessary for safety? If the answer is no again, then you come along, and that's not a control point. Okay, that's not a critical control point. Okay? If you come along here, is control at this station necessary for safety? And the answer is yes, then you need to go back up and you modify your process. Okay? So you use this diagram, this decision-making tree, to identify what is and isn't necessary in your CCP definitions. Okay? Again, this will be in your e-learning, so you can look at it more in depth, and then you'll get, as you read it through and through and through, because obviously the first time it's going to be sort of like, what? Huh? Control measure? I don't get it. But once you read it more, you'll start to understand, hopefully you'll start to understand what this means, right? So as I said, the control preventative measure is something like refrigeration, or cooking temperature, or cooling temperature, or TCS, right? In and out of the fridge, checking temperatures, right? If there is a preventative measure, that's your first step in determining whether it's a CCP or not. Okay? If the answer is yes, is the step specifically, so is that control measure specifically designed to eliminate or reduce the likelihood of an occurrence of a hazard, or reduce the likelihood to an acceptable level? Remember, we're either trying to eliminate the hazard or reduce a hazard, right? That's the point of a critical control point. Reduce or reduction. Reduction or eliminate, sorry. Okay, we're either trying to stop the hazard or just reduce it to an acceptable level. If your answer is yes, you're done. That's a critical control point. So if that control measure is designed specifically to either eliminate the hazard or just reduce the hazard, then you immediately stop, and that is 100% a critical control point. So using a decision tree is a way to eliminate all that writing on the board that we have, right? There's lots of writing on there, and in the end, only a few CCPs, right? Because we were able to go through and say, well, that's not really a hazard, and this is not really a hazard either. So if that step in your process is not specifically designed to eliminate or reduce the hazard to an acceptable level, the answer is no, then you go to the next question. Could contamination with identified hazards occur in excess of acceptable levels, or could they increase to an unacceptable level? If the answer is no, that's not a CCP, and then you stop. Okay? If the answer is yes, will a subsequent step eliminate identified hazards or reduce likely occurrence to an acceptable step or acceptable level? The answer is no. Critical control point. Okay? If the answer is yes, then it's not a CCP and you stop. Okay? So this decision tree can help you in determining. I can do it just through my head because I just know what is and isn't a hazard and what's likely to happen. Okay? But at this stage, you are not so likely to know what is a hazard, when it will occur, when it will not occur. So using a decision tree like this will help you to weed out things that would be prerequisites and things that would actually be critical control points. Okay? So just by answering yes or no, this will tell you basically right away whether or not it is or is not a critical control point. If the answer is no, it's not a critical control point, then it goes into your prerequisite program. And if the answer is yes, it is a critical control point, then you have to decide how you're going to track that throughout the process of cooking. So this is one example of a critical control point decision tree. There is another one, and this is called the Baldrum's critical control point tree, decision tree. And this is slightly different, it's slightly more modified. Okay? So question 1, is the hazard managed by the prerequisite program? Right, and we've talked already about our PRQs, or our prerequisite programs. So is the hazard managed by our prerequisite programs? If the answer is yes, not a CCP. So the first one I showed you is a little more intense. It's a little more detail-oriented, a little more exact. Okay? This one is a bit more streamlined. Okay? It's a bit easier to use. However, easier to use means easier to make mistakes. Right? So again, you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. So question 1, is your hazard managed by your prerequisite programs? If the answer is yes, boom, not a CCP. If the answer is no, are there control measures in place for the hazard? If the answer is no, then there's a question 2. Is control necessary? If no, stop. Okay? So if control is not necessary at this stage, then you don't need to go any further. Okay? The second part of that, if no, stop, it's not a CCP. If yes, you need to modify the step. So if control is necessary, and the answer is yes, then you need to go back to the beginning. Okay, you need to redo your process. Okay? You understand? It's sort of like a choose your own adventure book, right? With yes and no determining your path. So if you come along here, right, first question you've answered no. Is there a control measure in place? So do you have to cook it to 165 degrees? The answer is yes. Sorry, the answer is no. Then is control necessary? If the answer is no, you're done. It's not a CCP. If you have to, if there is a control measure that is in place or that is necessary, right, then you have to go back to the beginning and reassess your process. Why don't you have a yes answer? Okay. Then once you go through here, our control measure is there. So if you determine that there is a control measure but you answered no, then you need to go back and figure out why did we say no when it should have been yes. Because there is a control measure that we can use to control the hazard growing or exceeding its level. Okay? So if the answer is yes, is the process step specific, and this is where it gets similar to the other diagram, is the process step specifically designed to eliminate or reduce the hazard to an acceptable level? If the answer is yes, then again you go directly to critical control point, right, and you're done. Right? That's easy to do. If the answer is no, again, could contamination with hazard occur at unacceptable levels or increase to unacceptable levels if the controls are failed? If the answer is no, then you stop and it's not a CCP. If the answer is yes, will an additional process or an additional step then reduce the levels of contamination? Okay, so will an added step or added process reduce the will an added step or added process eliminate the hazard or reduce the hazard to an acceptable level? If it's no, that's a critical control point. Okay, so if you don't need to add something else, that makes it a CCP. Okay? If the answer is yes, then it's not a CCP. Again, these decision trees you have to use with a bit of caution, a bit of common sense, or else you're going to end up putting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of critical control points in your HACCP plan, which is not going to be good, because it's going to be way too difficult to manage. What you should do is both of these, either this initial decision tree or this secondary decision tree here, over the weekend or during next week, just take some time and read through it. Okay? If you have some questions or don't understand, it seems, yes?
Can you explain question number 2 again?
This one here?
Yes, sir.
Are control measures in place for the hazard? So, in your HACCP plan, do you have already a control measure? Being we cook it to a certain temperature, or we cool it to a certain temperature, or we check something for a physical hazard? Okay? If the answer is no, then you go to question 2A. Okay? Question 2A states that is control necessary? Okay? If the answer is yes, right, so there is control necessary at this stage, right? So we have to cook something to a certain temperature, but it's not in our process, right? So then we realize, wait a minute, we have to go back to our beginning because there is a control that we should be using, but it's not in our plan yet. So it's like if you get lost and you ask Google, hey Google, where am I? Right? So it's asking you, is there a control measure somewhere in the world, right? And they're all defined by food science and technology, right? All this information, like I didn't make up 165 degrees, like it's just, that's what it is, you know? That's from food science, right? They determined that 165 degrees eliminates bacteria. So that's a control measure we use, okay? So, if there's a control measure, for example, let's use the bolognese sauce, right? In our process, we're using the bolognese sauce, and question one, is the hazard managed by our prerequisite program? No, okay? It's not, because our prerequisite program doesn't cover cooking. It only covers receiving, right? So, we answered no. It takes us to our question two. Are control measures in place for the hazard? If we don't have in our plan that we cook it to 165 for 15 seconds, we would answer no, right? Because we don't have a control measure. Okay? That would take us to question 2A. Is control necessary? Yes, it is necessary, right? Because we know that if we don't cook our bolognese sauce to 165 for 15 seconds, then it could lead to exponential bacteria growth, which could lead to food poisoning, right, or foodborne illness, okay? If no, so is control necessary? If there's a no answer to that, so let's say we're talking about fruit salad, right? Is there a control process? No, okay? Then you would stop, okay? There's no CCP, okay? But if it's yes, so back to our bolognese sauce, right? Our bolognese sauce, we know we have to cook to 165 degrees, right? So now we've answered yes. Then we have to go back and modify the original step, the original process. Okay, we have to go back to here and look at our original process for making bolognese sauce. And why are we missing the 165 for 15 seconds part of that CCP? Does that make sense, kind of? I'm hoping, maybe? You look a little, you look a little like a deer in headlights, like, what is this yes, no business? Are you not understanding? Not really? Okay, so let me get, just put my pen away. Let me try to explain it again, okay? So, our process for making bolognese sauce, okay, which we get on the board over there. You were paying attention, yeah, I hope? Okay. So our process for making bolognese sauce, we identified different CCPs, right? One of those CCPs was that we cooked the bolognese for 15 seconds at 165 degrees, okay? But let's say we were making a new hazard plan, okay, a new HACCP plan, okay? But for the same thing, bolognese sauce, okay? And we went through and identified the different hazards and different CCPs. However, we forgot to identify the CCP of 165 for 15 seconds. We didn't add that to our plan, okay? So as we go through this decision-making tree, our bolognese sauce is the hazard managed by the prerequisite programs. So when we cook the bolognese, our prerequisite program only covers the receiving, okay? When we receive the ground meat and we store the ground meat, right? So the answer would be no, because our receiving doesn't cover the cooking, okay? The cooking process is not detailed in our prerequisite program. It's a secondary part of our HACCP plan. So, are control measures in place for the hazard? The hazard is bacteria growth in our bolognese sauce when we're cooking. How do we eliminate that hazard? Or 15, yes, I know. I'm hoping that more people would say that because it's been very, very much repetitive. So, is a control measure in place? No. Okay? Because in our HACCP plan we didn't include it. It's not in our plan. We just cook it and then cool it. Okay? But we don't include the 165 in our plan. Okay? So now we answered no, okay? Which takes us to the second question. Is control necessary? When we make our bolognese sauce, do we have to control the temperature we cook it to? Yes, okay? If the answer is no, so if we're doing something else, like making ice cream, we don't need to cook it to 165 because it'll never become ice cream at that temperature, right? So if we're making ice cream, the answer would be no, and we stop, okay? But we're making bolognese sauce, which means that the answer is yes. So then we have to go back and find out why is there a control available to us for cooking to 165, and why it's not in our HACCP plan. Why did we answer no when we should have answered yes? Okay? So this is a way for us to determine have we found all the hazards and all the control measures that we can. Okay? And again, this comes from studying HACCP and studying food science and food safety, the control measures that we use in kitchens. Okay? Does that make more sense? You have to look at this in terms of, we talked a lot about the different temperatures and principles like time and temperature control, FIFO, cooking temperatures, cooling temperatures, food danger zone. So you apply all that knowledge and information you have about TCS, FIFO, food danger zone, cooking temperatures, cooling temperatures, and you apply that information into this for each process. So with our bolognese sauce, is it covered by a prerequisite program? No. Are there control measures in place? Yes. Is the process step designed to eliminate or reduce the hazard to an acceptable level? So cooking it to 165 is designed to kill the bacteria, right? So the answer is yes. It's a critical control point, okay? So this decision tree will help you to decide whether something is or is not a CCP. If it's not a CCP, then you need to add it to your prerequisite program, okay? So both of these can be used. When you're determining CCPs. Again, like I said, you need to use common sense, right? Not everything is going to be a hazard. Not everything is going to be a CCP. When you determine your hazards, like we did earlier, we were talking about glass and metal and plastic, and we sort of determined, well, this isn't really likely, this is pretty likely, so we're going to add it to our hazard list. The other one, we add it to our prerequisite program. Okay? All right. So when you're formulating your CCPs, remember that too few CCPs may not provide enough safety coverage. So when you have finished doing a food safety plan, if there's only one CCP, you might want to look at that again, because that might be you haven't really covered enough areas, right? You're not really protecting yourself. You're not really adequately employing HACCP, okay? But if you have too many, right? If you finish doing your CCP plan for one dish and there's like 60, you gotta say, wait a minute, that's too many CCPs. Let's look at this again and determine really what is a CCP here, okay? What is a hazard really? Yes?
The vegetables usually go for CCP plannings.
That's a good question. Some do. When they become PHS, they do. So for example, lettuce, and I might actually have that in my, that question I might actually have in my PowerPoint. I can't remember if it's in here or not, but lettuce, for example, is not a PHF when it's a whole piece. Once it's been cut, it usually gets transferred to a PHF, which then could be part of your HACCP plan. Okay? So it really depends on what you're talking about. You really have, not, like I said, not everything is, HACCP doesn't apply to everything the same. For example, uncut lettuce is not a PHF, cut lettuce is a PHF. So you have to treat them slightly differently. So when you look at your HACCP plan, not too many and not enough. Okay? If you have too many, it's going to be a burden on your HACCP plan. It'll be very hard to manage. And if it's not enough, you probably haven't done it correctly. So it's important to think through all the CCPs. A common saying, or something that's very commonly said in hygiene and safety officials or hygiene and safety people in the industry, is that if everything is significant, then nothing is significant. Meaning that if everything is significant, every CCP is significant, then none of the CCPs will be significant. If you pay too much attention to all the CCPs, then none of the CCPs will be paid attention to. Does that make sense? It's one of those sayings, it's kind of like the yin and the yang, right? If you have tons of CCPs, you won't pay attention to all the CCPs, right? And so basically what that means is that you can't effectively manage a lot of CCPs in a single process. It's important to focus on the ones that are really essential for food safety, right? So you have to kind of, like making a statue, right? You start with a big piece, and you, until you've got the final product, right? So it takes a long time to kind of go through each process, and once you're there, then you'll have a very defined, effective HACCP plan, okay? That's really the key, is kind of making sure that you get rid of things that are extraneous to the system, okay? If you can deal with them in a prerequisite program, then get them out of your HACCP plan, okay? Again, common sense, right? Not everything can be in a prerequisite program, because then it won't be dealt with effectively in your HACCP plan, okay? When you're dealing with hazards and CCPs, a single hazard may require multiple control points, okay? So as an example, fruit purees that are going to be canned, okay, or jarred, like jams, okay? Those require 2 different CCPs for the same hazard. They have to be acidified and heat treated or thermal processed, okay? So sometimes a single product might require more than one CCP in a different line of work, okay? A different way to do it, okay? But again, that comes down to food science, which is all readily available in books, internet, etc. All the information that you need to determine these things is all around you, okay? But it's a lot of information. If we were to really go in depth about every single CCP and every single process, this course would be like 4 years, not 18 days, okay? So, you know, at any rate, the acidification and thermal processing of canned foods is what prevents botulism and toxins from growing inside that canned product, okay? So that's a 2-step process for one product, okay? Adversely, multiple hazards can be controlled by a single CCP. So for example, bacteria and parasites in apple juice can easily be controlled and killed by one thermal processing. Okay, so 2 different hazards, one CCP eliminates both. So occasionally, one product will require multiple CCPs, whereas one CCP will effectively kill 2 hazards in a product. Okay, so you get a bit of both from products. Okay, so it's not always one or the other. Now, we're not quite done yet. I thought I was going to get done early, but I guess not. Well, I guess we're a few minutes early. I just quickly want to show you some safety logs. Here are some safety sheets, just so, yes, of course I want to use Adobe. Okay, so for example, can you see this okay, or should I zoom in a bit? So for example, this would be an example, and I'll put a couple of these on your e-learning just so you can see them. Do not use them directly in your project, because obviously I'll know, right? This is an internal cooking temperature log, okay? And so basically what happens is, as the cook is cooking things, the chef or the cook has already knowledge, right? That's a prerequisite program, training. We cook chicken to 165, we cook beef to 145, we cook this to this, we cool this, you know, so they already know we cook eggs to 65 degrees, you know? So the chef already has the prerequisite knowledge to apply the HACCP controls. Now this is our record keeping, okay? So this is our CCP3, so this is the 3rd critical control point in the process of these things. So the cook would then, if it's poultry, the cook would describe exactly what the item is, okay? And usually what outlet in a hotel. Okay, they would say this outlet, this product. Exactly, very detailed. They would write what it is. They would then write what temperature they held it for. It's already predetermined, it's 15 seconds. So they would just fill in the accurate time they held it for, the name, just scoot along here.
When we do ours, we have to fill them up like if we work on the restaurant.
Yeah, it has to be just like if I was the health inspector and I came in like, I want to see your documents. All right? So it's got to be authentic. Okay? Fill it in however you want, right? But you know. And have one where you didn't achieve your critical limit and you have a corrective action, right? Okay, and then check by staff, right? So you put your name in here, the date, okay? Corrective action if necessary. So again, let's say that your internal temperature, you said you only held it to 145, then corrective action, reheat it to 165 for an additional 15 seconds, okay? So these forms are very detailed in terms of who's doing what, where they're doing it, and then they're all, this is for lunch, dinner, and breakfast, okay? So it's got all your 3 meal periods on here, and then at the end of the day, and you can see here, all your temperatures are down here, and then it's signed by the executive chef and the executive sous chef, and then it's kept on file for 6 months. So that's an internal temperature one. Service, so again, I'll just zoom in here a little bit. So this would be if you're holding food on a buffet. Again, it's got all your different CCP information on here, the exact description. Okay, are you holding it in a steam table, a buffet, a bain-marie, a food warmer? Okay, so what you're storing, where you're storing it, the temperature, beginning of service, middle of service, end of service. Okay, hot foods and cold foods, first service, second service, third service, end of service. Okay, so very detailed records of what you made, where you kept it, how hot it was, or how cold was it, because remember, cold food on a buffet has to be kept at a certain temperature, right? So very, very exact regulations for that as well. And again, they have one for lunch, they have one for dinner, and then again, they have, you fill in who checked it, okay, so the staff member checking the temperatures, and corrective action if needed. Okay, we got internal cooling. So again, we have a cooling log. Okay, so what is being cooled? The temperature. Are we using a blast chiller? Are we using an ice water bath? Type of container used. The person checking it. Okay, so the person cooling it or checking the final temperature. And then again, the corrective action if needed. Okay? So very, very detailed information. All the information pertaining to temperatures is also down here. Okay, so they have very thorough, very distinct information with regards to their food safety. Reheating temperature. Again, if you're reheating food, they have a temperature log here. What temperature is reheated to, what you're reheating, who reheated it, time taken to reheat it, and also corrective action if necessary. They even have one for thermometer calibration. So, again, it's very important to have an accurate thermometer when you're checking temperatures, right? So they have here what thermometer it is, where is it, are you using ice water, are you using boiling water, and then actual temperature, reference temperature, calibrated by the staff, comments, and hygiene manager. Normally what happens in a lot of kitchens I've worked in is at the beginning of shift, all the crew or the staff come together, there's a pot of boiling water, there's a pot of ice water, everyone puts their thermometers in the ice water, the hygiene manager checks, okay, oh, your thermometer is wrong, we calibrate it a little bit, put it back in, okay. Then we do it in the hot water, check, okay. Then you go and do your work, okay. Then dinner time, same thing, crew comes together, thermometer's in, all verified, done. But even the thermometers every day are checked, logged, and kept. So that, again, if there's a problem, the hygiene government comes around, and you can say, no, we followed all protocols, here's our cooking log, here's our cooling log, here's our reheating log, here's our thermometer log, everything the government could possibly want, right in front of them, no questions asked, okay? It would be very unlikely they would stay very long investigating it. They would probably leave very quickly because they know that you're following the procedures, okay? Any questions? Wonderbar. Have yourselves a nice weekend. As I mentioned, I will put this information, the PPT and also the forms, so the example forms, onto your e-learning this weekend or maybe today. Other than that, have a nice weekend, get some rest. I know you guys have worked hard the last few days, some more hard than others, I assume, or guess, or imagine. At any rate, have a very nice weekend, and we will see you all next Friday. Yes. Remember, remember our scheduling changes, right? Next Thursday, we have our class, right?
Yes.
Yeah? So remember that our class next Friday is actually Thursday. Same time, different room. Right up there. That terrible room. Turn the camera off! Don't worry, I'll edit it out. I'll put in like some cartoon or something, Homer Simpson, you know? In that. Anyway, so remember, same time, 1 to 3, H309. Okay? Shirley, you'll get the key. Yeah? Make sure the internet works, because I don't know last time what she did there, like Star Trek Terminator 3 stuff there. Nobody knows what happened there, like some Twilight magic. So remember that, and then also the following week, your class is 1 hour later, right? Because of Taika event, the Taiwanese something event. Only thing I know is the Taiwanese part. I can't remember what the Aika means. Taiwan. Oh, maybe it is actually Taika. Just means Taiwan culinary event. Anyways, so we'll start 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, December 10th. Okay. So Thursday, Friday morning, done, and then Friday morning, Friday 2. Okay, enough of this. Enough of this. Get out of here.